Months of painstaking toil and high-stakes maneuvering have led Ukraine to declare a major leap forward in their mission to retake Russian-occupied lands. Ukraine reported breakthroughs in Russia's defensive lines, but there are still several more challenges that they'll need to overcome before they've reached their goal of the Sea of Azov. Let's analyze three important questions. How did they engineer this advance? What strategic dance will Russian forces perform in response? And how might this pivot reshape the future of the war? I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Let's find out. The first thing you need to know is on July 26, the Ukrainian army made a major decision to commit a large part of its reserve forces in the south, including the 10th Corps and 82nd Air Assault Brigade. That's right, Ukraine's offensive officially began back in early June, but it wasn't until July 26 that they really went all in on one location. That's because there's always a kind of trade-off or risk when committing your reserve forces. It's a gamble because this means there's now potentially less Ukrainian reserves available to reinforce their own defensive lines. It's kind of like going all in on a pair of twos. Both sides are hoping to bluff the opponent. But as we'll see, there's actually some method to this madness, because the decision likely wasn't made lightly, and it suggests Ukrainian command has spent the last 2 months identifying weak points in Russian lines and believes there's a chance they can break through and exploit the gap. Exploiting the gap in this instance would mean squeezing 2 battalions through a hole in Russia's defensive line and advancing past their reserve forces. Now, I want to be upfront before I go any further. In case you haven't watched any of my videos before, I'm biased towards Ukraine. I'm a former US soldier and veteran of the war in Iraq. I'm very pro-US, but it doesn't mean that I won't try to be unbiased as possible, and I still encourage that you look up your own sources. The reason committing Ukrainian reserve forces is risky has to do with a report from the New York Times that states Russian forces are mounting their own offensive operations in northeastern Ukraine around the city of Kupiansk. Russia's choice to launch its offensive around the city of Kupiansk seems like it's happening in the middle of nowhere, and it makes us wonder and ponder on this seemingly weird call. Are they geographically challenged, choosing a location so far away from Ukraine and where their offensive might break through? Or is there some strategic wizardry going behind this decision? Why would Russian forces choose this city in particular instead of any other one across the front lines? It's likely exactly because it's literally the furthest city located away from Ukraine's own offensive push, all the way in the east. It's 380 kilometers, or over 210 miles, away from Ukraine's own major offensive push. This means Ukraine is forced to keep extra soldiers here to defend the line and prevent a breakthrough happening against them, far away. Russia's probably trying to tie down Ukrainian forces far away from where they want to be. In spite of this Russian offensive in the east, Ukraine is advancing in the south. US defense official John Kirby said, quote, "Any objective observer of this counteroffensive, you can't deny that they have made progress now." The most significant Ukrainian recent gains were observed in Zaporizhia Oblast along the southern portion of the front lines, when they retook the town of Ryazan on August 16th. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of these smaller cities incorrectly. This village itself is small and originally held less than 1,000 citizens prior to the war, but it sits straddled along the strategically important Maksym River. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are fighting here. This solid foothold on the eastern side of this river greatly increases Ukraine's ability to push east further into Russian-occupied territory without the need to conduct a deliberate or contested wet gap crossing, meaning that they don't have to worry about crossing a river while under heavy fire when they would be most vulnerable. This forced a reaction from Russian forces, who made a rare confirmation from the Kremlin that Ryazan was indeed lost. The Russian response is really notable here because they've turned to their trump card, their ace in their sleeve. The 76th Guard Air Assault Division was redeployed from their position in the south of Kharkiv to the village of Robotyne. There have been small shifts of Russian units prior to this, but this is the most significant because it represents the first major lateral redeployment of Russian forces to prevent a breakthrough. I think some of the headlines we're hearing right now calling this development in the war a quote-unquote breakthrough are a little bit misleading because it makes it sound like Ukrainian forces have already broken straight through all the defensive lines. I know that's what I think when I first hear that Ukraine has broken through the Surovinkin line. That's not incorrect, that's correct, they have, but it kind of makes it sound like they're already on the other side. This isn't to say that this isn't a significant development, it's huge. Ukrainian forces have crossed some sections of the first trench lines in some locations. The evidence for this comes from a video Forbes pointed to that shows Ukrainian soldiers taking artillery fire. The Ukrainian soldiers here appear to have already crossed the first trench line. However, it's important to use caution with calls of victory just yet. The Russian defensive lines are designed to be elastic and confusing, where sometimes the first trench lines weave in and out, and they're purposely there so that Russian forces can fall back. It's like breaching the castle's outer walls and then being in a better spot to assault the center. Saying this is a breakthrough is technically correct, because yes, Ukrainian forces have broken through the first defensive obstacle in the region, and they're onto the second defensive obstacle. So they've passed those minefields that were slowing them down. It took months of soldiers crawling on their bellies and slowly, carefully disarming mines. It's possible Ukrainian command was waiting for this first obstacle to be defeated before committing larger armored forces. Here's an example of how much mines have become just a regular Tuesday afternoon part of life in Ukraine. Mines have been totally normalized there. So why is this such big news? Ukrainian forces have finally reached within spitting distance, less than 1.5 miles from Russia's so-called Surovinkin line. The fortifications here are named after Russian General Surovinkin because it was constructed under his command. He's since been rumored to be under house arrest, though, for his connections to former Wagner commander Prigozhin. Since then, the picture on the battlefield has become more clear, and on September 23rd, Ukrainian forces have since broken through the second line of defenses in Verbove, which means they've cleared a path through the anti-tank obstacles, allowing armor to pour through. They're still 20 kilometers away from the city of Tokmak, which if they're able to capture that city, it will represent a real breakthrough in all of the layers of defensive lines, and it's the stated minimum goal of Ukraine's offensive at this point. The redeployment of Russian 76th Guard Air Division is Russia's hope that this force will stop the Ukrainian advance in its tracks. The unit is said to be one of the most combat effective and best equipped Russian units there are. Who exactly is Ukraine up against here? In command of this elite unit is 43-year-old Dennis Shishov. He likely has the rank of Major General and has received the Hero of Russian Federation medal for his prior actions in the Dnieper River in 2022. Reports indicate, quote, Denis's unit was responsible for seizing and holding a bridge near Kakhovka and reportedly repelled 7 Ukrainian attacks. He received shrapnel wounds to the head, but apparently survived. To give you an idea of his qualifications, he completed Ryazan Higher Airborne Command School in 2003 and training at the Combined Arms Academy of Russian Armed Forces in 2014. There's some evidence now that what we're witnessing here is the actual main effort of the counteroffensive from Ukraine, and what we saw in the past was only probing attacks like some people theorized. The Economist has a tracker that looks at daily updates of satellite sensing imagery of fires related to the war. Currently, these fires inside Russian-held territory is marked in red, and fires in Ukrainian-held territories marked in blue. This graph shows there's been an increase in frequent war-related fires since the start of the war, and even higher rates than Ukraine's last offensive. This is evidence that Ukraine is stepping up their artillery and bombardment. What's interesting to note here is that these fires were much lower in June when supposedly the offensive first began. If I were to speculate, it's possible that Ukraine didn't start their full effort until the beginning of the middle of August. Although the Economist article points out that this could in part be to the fact that in August it's more dry and conducive to showing additional fire data. And maybe those cluster bombs are also making it seem like there's more fire going on than there is. On September 10th, General Milley, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, explained what was at stake when he said, quote,
and there's still a reasonable amount of time, probably about 30 to 45 days worth of fighting weather left. So the Ukrainians aren't done, this battle's not done, and they haven't finished the fighting part of what they're trying to accomplish.
So the change in weather might be the offensive's worst enemy at this point, because intense rains will soon make the ground in Ukraine a muddy, soggy mess for heavy armored vehicles. However, Ukraine's intelligence chief said, quote, combat actions will continue in one way or another in the cold, wet, and mud. It's more difficult to fight, but the counteroffensive will continue. Ukraine's General Tarnavsky, who's in charge of the counteroffensive, said, quote, considering how we move forward, mostly without vehicles, I don't think the weather will heavily influence the counteroffensive. He's referring to the fact that both sides are advancing in small assault squads of 10 to 15 soldiers on the ground instead of large groups. We know in the south that Russia has taken the approach of elastic defense. In these situations, as we've seen in and around Robotyne, the Russians would conduct a very deliberate retrograde once Ukrainian forces were decisively committed, before Ukrainian units were reorganized into a hasty defensive posture. Russia would counterattack in force before Ukraine was prepared. While this was effective in slowing down the Ukrainian advance, its recent gains have been effectively consolidated, and it would take a greater deliberate push for Russia to retake it. That said, given how worn down Russian forces already are in the south, it's unlikely that they'll have the manpower or supplies to do so. Forbes even caught a glimpse of 30 Ukrainian Leopard tanks assembled in a field ready to join the fray. These tanks are a part of Ukraine's new 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which appears to be ready to back up the fight in Robotyne. Their mission? To reach the Sea of Azov and play the ultimate game of military connect the dots by driving a wedge into Russia's precious land bridge. Why, you ask? Well, it's simple. Cut off the supply routes. If you cut off the lifeline of Russia's military, then it starves them of their combat potential. It's tough to get exact numbers on this elite 76 Airborne division and their troop strengths. However, this report from the Center Naval Analysis that was studying Russian troop strength indicates that the VDV troop totals is about 42,000 personnel in 2020, and the Russian command was aiming to reach 72,000 personnel by 2022. But it's important to note that these Russian VDV reinforcements sent to Robotyne were not yet fully prepared or ready to conduct a defensive operation. The evidence from this comes from reactions that we see across Russia's internal dialogue. Russian mill bloggers have increasingly become critical of how the fighting is being handled across the board. These internet personalities that originally were simply extensions of Russia's own messaging are now in some cases turning completely against the official narrative of the Russian Ministry of Defense. These criticisms from the Russian mill bloggers have likely helped Russian forces address some of their tactical problems, though. This sparked the Russian government to determine how to censor much of the dialogue coming from these Russian sources to combat what they called information policy of unfriendly countries. During a psychological operations conference on the 17th of August, this coincides with China's gradually moving away from direct Russian alignment in this war, as seen with their Saudi Arabian peace discussions. Here, the goals for peace have continually begun to favor Ukraine, while China begins to limit drone exports to Russia as the fighting continues. As Ukrainian forces begin a more deliberate assault on the village of Robotyne as they've captured it, their emphasis is on disrupting Russian ground lines of communication, or GLOCs. Specifically hit were two bridges and the Chonar road bridge. These strikes forced Russia to reroute logistical efforts along less secure, longer routes, increasing Ukraine's ability to attrit Russian forces while they lack support. One strike in particular, on the Solsk airbase, sparked outrage among Russian bloggers as cheap Ukrainian quadcopter drones successfully destroyed two Russian jets on the flight line. It was because these aircraft were simply sitting out in the open on the air tarmac rather than inside of a hangar or even a camo net that they were able to be destroyed so easily with cheap drones. The fact that zero precautions were taken with vital military equipment and the subsequent outrage showed that these frequent rear-style attacks are able to degrade Russia's morale faster and easier than previous efforts that we've seen. The Russian Ministry of Defense asked Wagner mercenaries to sign allegiance to the Russian government, and this shows that this move is an attempt to help Putin to maintain internal control over this conflict. All of these efforts culminated on August 28th, when the Ukrainian forces retook Robotyne after weeks of fighting, through what many US defense officials claim to be the most heavily defended area in Ukraine. Looking at the live map from the Institute for the Study of War, we can clearly see Russia's three-tiered defensive lines. While the village of Robotyne itself holds a limited inherent value, its location past the first line of defense is what makes it so critical. By using this strategic foothold, Ukraine is now able to push units through less defended areas, with less minefields deeper south into the Zaporizhia region, towards the towns of Verbove and Novoplinsky. By clearing the minefields, it'll be easier to bring in armored units. This is important because it's where several lines of defenses converge. I said we're going to talk a little bit about what Russia's response is going to be, and I think what we're going to hear is increased talk of use of tactical nuclear weapons. If Ukraine continues to advance and make its way towards the Sea of Azov, just be prepared for Medved in Russia to make more claims that if Ukraine is successful, they will strike with atomic weapons. The Economist pointed out that the defensive lines past here are shallow and its reserves are more thin. Initial estimates claim that new military equipment sent to Ukraine are in part responsible for these advances. Ukraine has recently received Excalibur long-range precision munitions as well as additional Storm Shadow and cluster bombs. These weapons were able to help destroy Russia's logistics and defensive positions. Once the Western powers realized that minefields were a major impediment to the advance, they sent in new mine-clearing equipment that sped up the mine-clearing operations. The fruits of those labors are now just on display, I think. Video from the battle over the village shows combined operations between Ukrainian naval special forces conducting nighttime raids, under night vision, dodging Russian kamikaze drones, as well as the 47th Mechanized Brigade operating American M2 Bradleys as they begin to secure the area. Reports quickly followed just days after that fighting that are now extending from Robotyne to the village of Verbove, approximately 11 kilometers east. The current goal of this operation is seizure of Tokmak, a critical railroad juncture used by Russia to resupply and rearm defensive lines with material support from Crimea. In order to accomplish this, in addition to holding Robotyne from counterattack, Verbove and Novorokhovka will need to be under Ukrainian control. This would open up a large enough movement corridor for freedom of maneuver of larger Ukrainian units. While units capturing Robotyne were able to effectively operate at the platoon level, Tokmak will prove to be a new beast entirely. Not only is this a significantly larger and more complex target, but also an especially heavily defended point. Updated maps show that Russia has created deliberate defensive fortifications a full 360 degrees around Tokmak. Strikes through drones and artillery will be vital, something now possible due to Ukrainian forces being within firing range with their own indirect weapon assets. The eventual liberation of Tokmak, if Ukrainians can pull it off, would be a major victory in the southern region, cutting off Russian supplies across the front lines, as well as placing them one step closer to reaching the final goal of Mariupol. Another thing that was holding the Ukrainian advance back in the past was the Ka-52 attack helicopter, which continues to be highly dangerous to Ukrainian vehicle formations, because Ukraine's armored formations are forced through narrow and predictable routes through these massive minefields. These aircraft, however, are increasingly taking losses over the course of the counteroffensive in both the east and south. This is giving Ukrainian armored formations much better breathing room. It's this breathing room that has allowed for what's being deemed as a significant breakthrough in the Sorovinkin line. Other Russian telegram sources are of course providing contradictory information in claiming that no breakthrough has been accomplished and Ukraine is suffering heavy casualties. This claim, however, is not supported by recent actions in which Russian authorities began evacuating Tokmak. Not exactly something you would do if you didn't feel there was at least a bit of a threat. Ukrainian units have begun encountering logistical units, and while these are generally less combat capable than standard forces, they still pose a significant threat and an obstacle that Ukraine will be forced to overcome as they push further towards the coastline. This is undeniable proof, though, however, that legitimate progress is being made. As reports of a tentative breakthrough in southern defensive lines continue, it's important to understand this is only one part of a larger operation and that the future of this counteroffensive might still be up in the air. Despite the success in the south, the eastern portion of the operation has still made only small, incremental gains since June. The military scholar Frederick Keegan and former CIA director David Petraeus described the difficult nature of these kinds of operations and what a protracted counteroffensive actually looks like. Quote, defenders can hold for a long time and then suddenly break, allowing an attacker to make rapid gains before the defense solidifies further to the rear. In short, it'll be a series of breakthroughs for the remainder of the counteroffensive. The significance of each depends on how rapidly Ukraine can seize and hold territory, while Russian units rush to re-establish their own defensive lines. Rather than a continuous, predictable progress, it'll be inconsistent, but larger gains are likely to be rapid. The nature of this possible breakthrough and its significance is still up for debate, due to all Russian forces seemingly being already committed to the fight. However, it's not clear how committed Russia will be to halting these penetrations in their lines, as it will inevitably threaten the integrity of other locations. The United States has recently approved 2 major aid packages to be sent to Ukraine, consisting of HIMARS and howitzer ammunition, Patriot rounds, javelins, small arms ammo, as well as additional breaching assets for clearing and proofing minefields. All of this coming at a cost of about $450 million, as the Biden administration is requesting a total of $24 billion of expected funding, a higher number by any measure, but absolutely critical to the success of Ukraine, as they fight the hardest part of the war to date. If you found anything valuable in this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and we have 2 other videos here for you if you're interested in watching more. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Thank you.